Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Hello, everyone. Let me try putting my headphones real quick. Sorry, y'all. It's always that's worse. Are you getting an echo at all? Yeah. But now it's gone away. Okay, so maybe we're good. Sorry about that. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event with Danesha Seth Carley and Ann Spafford for Pollinator Gardening for the South. My name is Talia, and I am the events manager here at Flyleaf. Thank you so much for joining us. We are super excited about this event, about how to create havens for pollinators in your very own front yard. Let me see, I have a million windows open, so let me pull up your bios. I'm sorry, I'm not usually this disorganized. We were just troubleshooting tech right before we got online, so it's a little bit more chaotic than normal. And there's a tornado warning.
Yeah, the tornado watch doesn't help, does it?
No, I'm stressed now. Okay, hold on. All right. So a few quick reminders before we get started. If you'd like to support our authors tonight or the bookstore, you are welcome to buy a copy of Pollinator Gardening for the South from Flyleaf. There's a link just below our faces, as well as if you have already bought a copy but you'd like to support Flyleaf, there is a donate button on the bottom of your screen, and any small amount, a few dollars, helps us continue to put on programming for you all. I would like to also encourage you to check out our full events calendar. This season involves a little bit of everything from nonfiction about Confederate monuments to novels ranging from romance to domestic thriller. You can access the full schedule by clicking on our Flyleaf Books profile on Crowdcast or going to crowdcast.io/flyleafbooks. All right, without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our guest tonight. Danesha Seth Carley is Associate Professor of Horticultural Science at North Carolina State University and Director of the Southern Integrated Pest Management Center. And Ann M. Spafford is Associate Professor of Horticultural Science at NC State and co-author of Rain Gardening in the South. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our authors and pull up this PowerPoint. I will be going through the slides, so ordinarily, you know, the authors would just click through, but they're going to tell me when to click through just to make sure that everything works seamlessly tonight. Thank you for your patience and understanding as we deal with, you know, difficult tech per usual.
So Talia, Ann and I will plan to leave time for question and answer at the end. And is that something the folks can drop in the chat as they're thinking of questions? Okay.
Absolutely. If you have any questions, you can use the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen or drop it in the chat anytime throughout the event. And then at the end, when y'all are ready to take questions, just let me know and I can read those out loud to you.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you.
Let me pull this up. Can you see it?
No, I see a black screen that says you are screen sharing, but it didn't have our slides.
Okay, one more time. How about now?
Yes, it's in notes view, and it looks like perfect. Talia, you nailed it. We got it. So just in case anyone has forgotten what presentation they're joining this evening, welcome from myself and from my lovely co-author, Ann Spafford. This is our talk and presentation on pollinator gardening for the South, creating sustainable habitats. Next slide. So this evening, Ann and I are just going to give you a little bit of a taste of what you might find in our book. And we hope that you find it both fun to read, enriching, delightful, and full of colorful information. And I want to start this evening by asking you, and normally we would, of course, of you face to face. And I would ask for a show of hands on this slide. How many of you feel that 50% of these animals or insects presented on this slide would be pollinators? Then I would ask you how many would say that 80% are pollinators? Then if I were to ask you how many believe 100% of these insects and animals displayed on this screen are pollinators, any of you who raised your hand or nodded, your approval to the 100% would be true. When we're talking about pollinators, for the most part, I tend to talk about bees with a little bit of talk about flies and butterflies, but less so because bees are my favorite pollinator. And we know that everyone has their favorites and it's okay to have a favorite, but mine are bees. Most of the time when Anna and I are talking about pollinator-friendly plants, whether or not we say that the plants are good for bees or they're good for butterflies or they're good for moths or hummingbirds, almost every plant that we talk about is really good for any of those pollinators. Again, we just sometimes tend to mention our very favorite pollinators. And again, in my case, it's bees. So butterflies don't make great pollinators, but they're still really beautiful and they do indeed pollinate plants. You've got bumblebees, of course, bats, hummingbirds, even lizards can be pollinators. And then, of course, flies as well. But bees are indeed the most efficient pollinators, and that's why we tend to talk about them most when we're talking about pollinators. Next slide. Thank you. So just a gentle reminder, pollinating insects are really important, in particular for agriculture. And when we talk about pollination and the importance of pollination to agriculture, many of us think about the honeybee. Of course, honeybees are a very important pollinator in agriculture. In part, that's because we're able to put them in hives and move them up and down the East Coast, across the Midwest, and out to California. Think of them as like little tiny livestock on the back of trucks, moving from Florida through the Carolinas, up to Maine's cranberry fields, and then out all the way through the Midwest to California to the almond field. There is a huge benefit of honeybees to agriculture, and because we manage honeybees, it's easy for us to estimate the benefit of honeybees. And economists have sort of estimated that the benefit of the managed honeybees to American agriculture is over $1.6 billion annually. It's important to remember that it isn't just honeybees that are doing the heavy lifting. There are a lot of native bees that are important to agriculture as well. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, native bees are very important to agriculture, and we actually dedicate an entire chapter to our native bees in our book. This is just a little teaser example of a number of bees that's not uncommon to find in North Carolina and across the South. So there are over 4,000 native bee species, and again, there are some examples. You might even recognize some of these. But North Carolina sports over 500 native bees. And so when we're talking about the importance of having pollinator habitat, we aren't just talking about the importance of feeding the honeybee, which if you like honeybees, is a great thing to do. But all of these beautiful and colorful native bees also need a home and they need food. These bees in particular get their food, which is in the form of nectar, which is sugar, or proteins and fats, which are carbohydrates. And so the nectar provides the sugar, and then the pollen provides the protein and the fat for the animals to survive. Next slide. There are a lot of reasons, unfortunately, that pollinator populations are in decline. Both our managed bees, whether it's bumblebees or honeybees, the social bees, or our native bees, which tend to be solitary, just as we were talking about. All of those populations are in decline for some reason or another. You can see the pie chart here, the different reasons that pollinators are in decline. Some of it is pesticide exposure, primarily in home lawns or in agricultural settings. Climate and weather impact our bees a great deal. There are diseases, if you can believe it, and pests that affect our bees. But pollinator habitat and nutrition, or the loss thereof, is also a huge driving factor when we're talking about the population decline. The only good thing about that is that of this pie chart and those 4 things I mentioned, we have a great deal to do with being able to protect our pollinators by adding additional habitat around our yards and our green spaces, whether it's greenways or school or golf courses or community areas. And that's, of course, what Ann and I are talking about in our book. Next slide. So I'm just going to give you a little bitty taste of what you might read more about in the book, and then Ann's going to get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty details. But just to get us started thinking about how to create pollinator habitat, one of the things that Ann and I both like to say is that there's no wrong way to plant a pollinator garden. When you're thinking about beautiful gardens and you're picking plants that you enjoy, for the most part, the pollinators are going to enjoy them too. So a few things to think about is to be diverse. Also, you want to think about planting the diverse plants that you have in your garden in clumps. Honeybees, for example, prefer to forage on a foraging trip on the same types of flowers for each trip. So in science, we call this floral constancy, and not all bees do this. Bumblebees will flit to any flower that strikes their fancy. But bumblebees are generalists, as are honeybees. But again, honeybees prefer to forage on the same type of flower in your garden or on anybody's garden in one trip. So if you're planting in clumps, you're not only being design forward thinking, as Ann will talk more about later, but you're also really helping those little ladies that are out there working to get that pollen, and so you're helping them out as well. Another thing that you might think about doing, especially if you're new to gardening or new to the South, is keeping records of dates when you see plants that you enjoy or plants in your garden even, and just pull out your garden journal, make some notes about when you see things blooming. I'm a long-term Southern gardener, and I still do this. It's just a habit. I've noticed over time that my notes get a little bit more detailed, or I'm writing down things that I haven't been thinking about in the past. And so it's really nice to go back through those journals and see how my ideas about what plants I prefer have changed, but also the bloom dates on some of my plants and the types of pollinators I'm seeing visiting them. Next slide. And of course, bees need a place to live. Bumblebees, in many cases, and honeybees, of course, are kept in hives. But if you're talking about the native bees, we call them solitary bees because they aren't living together in a colony like honeybees do. They also need a place to nest. And so something that you can do, which is one of my very favorite activities to do with a school group or a scout group or even my son on a weekend, is to build what is commonly called an insect hotel. And you can see an example of this here. And you can be as creative or interesting or as much fun as you want to have with these projects. They can be small, they can be large. And I have a link here to one that describes how you can build one very, very easily. But these bees all need different types of places to live. And so if you can think about as many different types of solitary bees as there are, and even if you aren't familiar with them, you saw already a little bit of diversity in those solitary bees in the pictures that I showed you. They need all different types of places to nest. Again, we don't give them places to nest because we're not building them managed hives like we do our honeybees, but they do like to nest in old straw or in old logs or even in stems of grass. Something else that some of our solitary bees prefer, believe it or not, is actually to nest right in bare ground. One of the things you can do if you want to make sure that you're providing appropriate habitat for those ground nesting bees, like mason bees, for example, is to actually make sure that when you're mulching your garden, you're not putting in heavy mulch. Definitely not using plastic in your garden. That's not environmentally friendly at all. Of course, it does help keep the weeds down, but it doesn't give those solitary bees a place to nest. So if you are mulching, make sure that you're leaving some bare areas for your ground nesters. Actually, digger bees are a better example of ground nesters. Describes exactly how they like to nest. They dig right into the ground and make little holes where they lay their eggs. Something else, and Ann will talk a little bit about this, later is that grasses, while not great pollinator forage because they don't provide either pollen or nectar, they do provide bees a great place to live through the winter. And you can see, I think, in this middle photo, and I'm not really sure what folks are able to see or not, but in that middle photo, you see one of my very favorite grasses here in the Southeast, and that is blue stem. And the bees, and you see here on the right, the little bee poking out of the stem, really love to drill holes and nest in those stems. And so you can leave your grasses in your garden through the fall to add a little bit of element of decoration to your garden, a little interest in your garden through the winter, as well as allowing a place for those bees to survive through the winter into the spring. Next slide. And then we probably have a lot of turf grass in our yards that we can convert over to either pollinator gardens that are formal or informal, or simply just something that I like to say is other. And so these are actually two pictures that I took in my yard where I do have a formal turf grass area, but it's quite small. And then the areas around it are not formal gardens as much as I've just allowed sort of the native weedy species, if you will, to come into that area and take over. Here you see two of the early spring bee favorite forages, and that is in the case of dandelions and the white clover. They actually provide really rich nectar in the case of the clover and pollen in the case of dandelions for bees that need it especially early on in the spring. So you can consider reducing the amount of turf grass in your yard, being more environmentally forward by either just stopping mowing in certain areas or putting in a more formal garden, which of course we're going to be talking about in a little bit. Next slide. And then seasonality. And I don't want to steal Anne's thunder. She's going to talk more about seasonality, but seasonality really is important. And remember that bees are really looking out in the environment for the food that they need to survive, not just for themselves, but also for their young. And so we are not necessarily thinking about bees needing different types of forage throughout the year, but they absolutely do. They need carbohydrates, which just gets them from place to place. They need pollen that they're collecting for their young. And the flowers that we have in our gardens or in our urban green spaces are providing both the pollen and the nectar for the bees all year long. And that's really, really important. Even in the winter time, again, habitat is important. Leave those grasses or bundled twigs in your yard if you can stand it to provide the habitat. And then early spring, depending on the weather, of course, it can be in early March or late February, the bees start to come out, and that's when they need the nectar and the pollen. So we want to think about seasonality when we're choosing what elements or what flowers we want in our garden. Next slide. And then pollinators have three basic needs, a lot like plants in your garden and a lot like people. They need a safe space that they can use to survive or lay their eggs, as we already talked about. They need food, and we talked about that as well. The plants that you select to put in your garden are going to help those bees and the butterflies by providing pollen and nectar. Something we don't always think about, but can add a really lovely artistic element to the garden, as well as something that bees and other pollinators need, and that is a water element. I know here in the South, the first thing people think about when they think about having water in their garden is mosquitoes. And while I'm a big fan of biodiversity, I can't say I'm a fan of mosquitoes. And so we've come up with a few really interesting ways that you can add a water element to your garden, but not promote mosquitoes or mosquito larvae. And you can see a few different examples here. You can add different types of plants to your garden that might capture water. Those include lotus or hosta or elephant ear. You can see I have a picture down here of a plant, elephant ear, that's collected some water. Sometimes I use glass bottles. I don't have young children anymore, so it's not a safety issue. You see they have that little indentation in the bottom of the bottle. Just stick them right in the ground, and as it rains, the water will collect, but it doesn't leave enough water for the mosquitoes to be attracted to it. And then also you can just leave the bottom of a pot or a small container with stones and twigs in it. Again, it's not deep enough to promote mosquito larvae growth, but your pollinators will thank you because they can walk right on the edge of that lip, go ahead and dip their toes in, take a bath, or drink some water in your garden. Next slide. Everyone always asks us what are our top 5 favorite landscape plants, and it's like picking a favorite child. Of course, I have a favorite child, but I'm allowed to say that because my son's an only child. But how do you pick one favorite plant, right? So I went ahead and did it anyway, even though I would like to add the caveat that these are only a few of my favorites, but I did want to mention a couple by name. I'm not going to go through all of them. I will mention the mountain mint is a really lovely native. In fact, all of these are native to North Carolina and the Southeast, and these are all also perennials. The mountain mint is lovely. It also provides a really nice scent as you walk through your garden. And even though it might not be terribly showy, it provides very rich forage for our pollinators, and they attract many different types of pollinators, not just honeybees. Coneflower is lovely. All right, I am going to talk about all of them, but I'm not going to talk about them a whole lot. Coneflower is lovely. You see that's marked number 2. I like coneflower a lot, not only because it provides really lovely bee forage. You often see beautiful butterflies also extracting nectar from these plants. And then in the fall, the seed heads of the coneflower will also bring goldfinches to your garden. So it provides not only pollinator habitat, but that wildlife habitat and forage as well. Butterfly weed, you can never go wrong with an asclepias, no matter which one you pick. It's a lovely butterfly weed or milkweed or any of those, of course, are wonderful forage and also provide food for monarchs as well. And then the asters, which Anne will talk more about, they're really lovely. They're sometimes tall, sometimes they're short. They get moundy. They're all different colors. I can't say enough about asters. And I like them because they last really long into the fall. And then lastly, the Gaillardia or blanket flower, number 5. I like it because it looks like just a huge pop of color. And I really love those colors in my garden. Next slide. But then folks often ask us as well about what plants for shade, because all the plants I've already talked about actually prefer full sun. In fact, pollinators also prefer full sun, but shady plants are important as well, and some people only have shady gardens. And so in order to set you up for success, I went ahead and just put this slide together to demonstrate a few of the shady plants in my garden that are successful. Lenten rose is one of my favorites. It's in full bloom right now. And of course, it has that really dark green leathery foliage that remains dark green all through the year. So it also provides that extra element in your garden. The wild bergamot, or bee balm it's sometimes called. This one is a native species, the purple one that you can see with the bumblebee clinging to it in the top right corner. That's a really lovely one that will work in light shade. I'm not sure, and Anne might have an idea. Do the Monarda in general do well in shade, Anne, or is it just the wild bergamot? No. Okay, so Anne, I was suspecting as much. So if you want to go with the shade bee balm, you want to make sure you're going with the native cultivar and not one of the hybrid cultivars. Wild geranium, not pictured, is also really lovely. And then golden Alexander is one of my very favorites. That plant is what I call bossy, and it can grow, it can spread quite a bit in a really sunny garden, but it also grows nicely. Anne's saying, yep. It also grows really nicely in the shade, and the shade will keep it knocked back a little. It won't be quite as bossy. And then 2 shrubs I just want to mention. 2 of my very favorites is plethora, which has, again, that really nice, rich green foliage, and then the Fothergilla. All make really lovely pollinator habitat, especially if you're in a shady garden. Next slide. And then just a few last minute things to consider. You know, these modern hybrid flowers can be really stunning in the double or triple or completely, I guess they call them doubled flowers. But in the case of this dahlia here, you can see that it's a really beautiful flower, very striking and very showy. But unfortunately, because of the way we breed these plants, that their pollen is made very difficult to be accessed by pollinators. And so these plants do not make good pollinator habitat. And in many cases, they don't produce pollen at all. So I'm not saying you shouldn't add them to your garden, but if you're only planting with pollinators in mind, I would say go for the non-hybrid or non-doubled flowers. Also, of course, it stands to reason if you're trying to promote beneficial wildlife in your yard, bees, beetles, butterflies, then it's best just to forego the pesticides if you can stand it and don't use them in your yard, or even put up signs if you're really concerned, so that if people are spraying for mosquitoes, they hopefully will avoid the edges of your yard as well. And then lastly, it's always a really nice thing to add larval host plants. I mentioned monarch butterflies and the common milkweed earlier. Dill and parsley are really nice host plants for larval caterpillars. Zizia makes a really nice host plant as well. And so that just adds additional biodiversity to your garden. Next slide. Okay, and then Talia, you can just run through these. So in short, no matter what your garden or your pollinator habitat looks like, that's fine, thank you. No matter what your garden or pollinator habitat looks like, there's no right or wrong way to provide habitat for your pollinators. Whatever you are able to offer them, they'll be thrilled to see, and you'll be helping pollinators far and wide. Next slide, please. All right, so I've told you a little bit about the elements you want to have in your garden. We talked about specifics, but now Anna's going to take you from how to wow.
Great. Next slide, please. Thank you, Danesha. I was chomping at the bit, like I didn't want to like interrupt, but I'm like, oh yeah, and another thing, and another thing. So I love it in my section. Danesha usually does pop in, and that's totally fine. We like to have a dialogue going, and you can see we laugh at each other's jokes, so it's all good. So I love to start with this slide because most of us who care about pollinators, we tend to also love native gardens, and we like things that are a little more wild. And man, if every subdivision front yard looked like this, I would actually consider moving to one, right? But unfortunately, that's not the case. Most of the time, we see front yards that look like the background of this slide, where it's just grass. And I'm not, against all turf, but I teach landscape design at State, and I always emphasize with my students, like, whatever we're designing, it has to be used, right? So if you're using turf for entertainment space, overflow space, party space, kid running around space, pet space, awesome. That tends to be in the backyard. How often do you see people utilizing the front yard in that manner? Not as often. And yet we put a ton of resources and time and energy into making this pristine front yard. So it's just so much work to do that. But the idea of doing what we're seeing in the front of this slide is also a hard sell. There's actually quite a bit of research out there that talks about, yeah, people love the idea of nature and they like wild looking things when they are in nature. As soon as you get into a neighborhood or, like a subdivision development, that goes out the window, and people are predisposed to see neat, clean, tidy edges. And we really need to emphasize that people want to see what we call cues to care, right? So someone might think that this just looks like a hot mess, where it looks beautiful to the person who created it. But if you just give some cues that would help someone understand that this is very purposeful, like maybe there's this low growing evergreen hedge, like informal hedge that contains it, like maybe it's a native evergreen holly, then it's done. And then people are like, oh, okay, that's deliberate. We're all good, right? So this is a hard sell, and it's really not realistic to say, come on, everybody, just get rid of all the turf in your front yard. So next slide. So there's an easy way to do that. And I don't know if you guys have read Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, but he advocates, like we do, for just reducing the amount of turf in the front yard. And what I'm showing on this slide is on the left, what is typically given for a new planting at a subdivision house or new construction, any new construction. And it's showing the bird's eye view, like eye in the sky kind of thing. And you usually get some foundation plants along the front of the house. Those are important because it softens the connection of where the vertical facade of the house meets the ground. That's a pretty harsh connection. So the plants at that juncture help to soften that. So it's a good thing. However, it's very, I was going to say like lowbrow, but it's very uninteresting. And they often use plants that don't really serve much other than doing that function. And in design, we tried to pick plants that serve many functions. Like, yes, we want a foundation plant, but can it be food producing or pollinator supporting, right? So we want to try to layer some functions. But it's not too hard to renovate this garden. So you can leave all those plants in place. And in the picture in the middle, I'm showing you can just extend the bed out. And that's where you can start implementing some pollinator supporting plants, right? So let's just say the foundation plants are evergreens and they're shrubs. Well, now you've got room by bringing out that bed edge to incorporate some perennials or other shrubs that are pollinator supporting. And then the last image on this slide is bringing that bed out even more. And this can be done over time, right? Very few people come in and do this massive landscape renovation all at once. You can do a little bit at a time, and it's easier on your pocketbook. And it just looks better and better every time you add a layer. And in this last one, it's like I brought the bed out to incorporate that tree. So now you don't need to mow around a tree, thank God, right? And now you have like way more plants to fit in that can all be pollinator supporting. And you still have enough turf in there. So let's just say you live in a neighborhood with an HOA. They're still going to support that, right? Because they still have lawn planting. The house still looks nice, so it ticks all their boxes as well. Next slide, please. So I get really excited. I joke with my students, I talk really fast, and I know that I do that, and it's usually because I'm just really passionate about what I'm talking about. Sometimes it's also because I'm highly caffeinated, and heaven help us if it's the two things together, but today it's just passion. I have not done caffeine for this whole pandemic. That's just a recipe for disaster. So on this slide on the left, I love to talk about the fact that what pollinators need in a garden actually overlays quite beautifully with what humans want and need in a garden. So pollinators need to have different flower shapes and sizes. So Danesha just gave you a quick introduction to like several different kinds of bees, and you notice that some are really big, some are really small. And so they need flowers that can support that. And what humans want is lots of color in the garden. And so this translates into a garden design that embodies lots of drama, right? So different flower shapes and sizes get us there, and then also different colors, right? So the next point is pollen and nectar, spring through fall, are critical for pollinators, right? As soon as they start flying, like Danesha said, they need energy, they need sustenance, right? So we have to have plants at the ready to support that. What humans want related to this is, man, if we could have our garden showy for as much of the year as possible, that would be ideal. And so translate this into garden design. This means that we really need to carefully craft wave after wave of blooming things, right? And maybe thinking about trees and shrubs and perennials, but we want to make sure that we've got something going on from, well, like now, but we started having some warmer temperatures early and the bees come out, right? So from like early March all the way through till November. And luckily we live in the South where we can actually do that. I'm from Illinois originally. Shh, don't tell anybody. It's okay. I'm a Southerner at heart, but we could not do that there, right? But in the South we can. Hooray! So the third point on that chart is that pollinators need diversity of flowers for best nutrition, right? So different flowers have different protein content, other nutritional aspects. And so if you planted a lot of one thing, you're really not setting up the pollinators for optimal health. It's like if we went out and ate singular thing, that's not good for us. It's the same thing with the pollinators. So in terms of what humans want in a garden, that means if we have lots of different things, that's lots of interest for us, and we like that. So in a garden, that translates to high diversity of plantings, and that relates to the other drawings on this slide, but I'll come back around and talk about those in a second. Let me finish off my chart. So pollinators also need winter habitat, like Danesha said, and humans really would still love to have some aspect of their garden looking amazing in the winter. And so we want to figure out, how do we work in winter structure and interest? We still want a garden to register as a garden, even in the dead of winter, right? We can't just say, oh, the garden is done. It's not going to look like anything until spring. It should still read as a garden, even in the dead of winter. And so in garden design, we do that by incorporating ornamental grasses, right? We could also do like evergreens and some shrubs for structure, but in terms of helping our pollinator friends, man, ornamental grasses is where it's at, right? Because they will be beautiful in the growing season and then they just go dormant, but their above ground growth remains, right? So it's the same height, the same habit. They still blow in the wind, right? Or like in our stormy day today, they're probably whipping like this, right? But that still provides really beautiful interest in the winter, right? And they just turn this, you know, various shades of, well, this is hilarious. As a designer, I was going to say tan and russet, and homeowners are like, you mean brown? Just say brown, right? But to me, the dormant colors are also beautiful because you still see a variety or different shades of brown and tans and beiges and whatever. And then you also still see the different textures, right? Some grasses are very thin blades, some have wide blades, and that still registers to us even in the winter. So the drawings that I'm showing on the right side of this slide, that first column is a plan view, right? So as if you're flying overhead, looking at the space. And then the last column on the right is what that garden looks like from the side. So if you kind of crouch down and looked at it from the side. And what I like to explain to my students is one of the hardest design aspects to get a handle on is this idea of variety, right? It's a really important design principle, but it is also the one that often comes from the gut, right? So it's how much stuff is enough stuff to put in this garden bed. Too little, and it might register as quite boring and monotonous, and too much, like I think in the book, Danesha, don't you say like yes please to like plant types, right? So
everything, Anne.
one of this can just look like madness, right? So, but any one of these situations can be technically right depending on the context and the goals of the design and the needs of the client. So that first one that seems so boring up at the top, maybe it's like a really awesome ground cover, but it's just in a place where someone's just biking by, right? No one's hanging out near that garden, so you don't need to work in a lot of diversity. But you can see that as you kind of work your way down the drawings, you can add a little more stuff. We're taking away some of the ground cover to make room for some shrubs and then a tree. And then we're going to mix up the larger plants in there. And now it's like, wow, well, that's compelling. And that's interesting. It's got enough layers. So the bottom image would be a garden where someone is probably hanging out close by. Maybe there's a really comfortable bench close by and they're sitting, they're lounging, they're just taking in this beautiful garden. And so it also helps to think about, okay, what do the bees need? And so when we start layering and all the things I talked about on the chart, like you need to have lots of diversity, which means you need the layers, right? So those first couple drawings, not going to cut it for pollinators. You really need to be looking at the second to the last set of drawings, the last drawing at the bottom, because those have the diversity that the bees needs. It sounds like I said the bee's knees, right? It's like, no, I'm in a different age bracket than that. Although I do use, sorry, I do use like sayings that are like older than me. I just love them. Were you born in 1895? No, but I do like that time period. So sorry, I'm like going off on a tangent. So this last drawing, it shows like an ornamental grass, right? So that provides the winter interest. It's got layers, it's got lots of things. So the bottom drawing is actually what would be better for our pollinator friends. Next slide, please. So design strategies. And one of the important aspects of this book that was important to Danesha and I is that we're bringing together like the best pollinator information and the best design information, because we talk to a lot of homeowners and they're frustrated because not every book has all the pieces, right? So that's one of the reasons why we created this book. And the design strategy that you take on for your pollinator habitat, I think, is really important to set off right off the bat, right? So in the picture on the left, I'm showing a naturalistic front yard garden, right? Some people love the look of nature and they're like, we're not as concerned with the structure of the garden. We just want to make sure we get the right palette of plants in there and the right kinds of layers that that is appropriate for the ecology that we're designing in. And this is the garden of Nina Marie Lister, who's an ecologist up in Canada. And she has battled with the city for such a long time, even though the way that they've written their guidelines, this fits. But her neighbors complain because it looks too wild and they've just been battling forever. But it is extremely pollinator supportive, but it's not everybody's cup of tea. So what's another strategy that might work for you or your neighborhood? So I'm a huge fan of Pete Udolph. If you don't know that designer, man, Google him right as soon as we're done tonight. Just amazing. And he does phenomenal designs with lots of perennials. And this presentation is more perennial heavy. But you can look in the book for like other shrubs and some trees information. But Pete Udolph designs in two ways, right? He started out doing massed plantings, right? So if you look at the slide, the image in the middle, you can distinctly see, oh, there's a big mass of coneflower. There's a big mass of one species of ornamental grass. And then there's another big mass of an ornamental grass. And then a big sweep of something else. And so entomologists will say, oh man, bees would love this because they don't have to spend a lot of energy going from flower to flower. It's already right there, right? And that's completely fine. There's nothing wrong with that strategy. This isn't necessarily better design-wise than, say, the picture on the far right, which is a strategy we call intermingled, where same designer, Pete Udolph, but now, even though it is heavily designed, right, he actually draws out each clump of plant and he figures out where things go initially, understanding that, well, it depends. Some designers who design like this know that the garden will take on a life of its own, right? So they'll reseed and the garden will kind of evolve on its own. Other designers are more heavy-handed in their garden management. They're like, no, I want it to look this way. And they'll go out and they'll deadhead early to make sure that it kind of stays like this. However you want to take on the management is up to you. But I love the intermingled because it doesn't look human-built. The one in the middle, it's naturalistic, but it's definitely more built than the first image, right? And then the intermingled does not look human-built. But what I also like about this is if, let's say, some tall weeds pop up in there, going to be way less noticeable than if weeds popped up in the middle image, right? So let's just say you're just not that into garden management, or, you know, things get away from you a little bit. You have a little bit of a grace period with the intermingled approach. So just put that in your brain. It can be a really excellent tool. Next slide, please. All right, so as Danesha mentioned, the seasonality is absolutely key. However, this tends to be a really hard nut to crack for homeowners to design because, you know, pull out a garden catalog, or let's just stick with the garden catalog. It only shows when the plant looks amazing when it's in bloom. It's like, well, I need to know what a plant looks like before it looks amazing when it's in blooming. What does it look like when it's done? What does it look like when it's in seed? You never find that range of pictures, right? You've got to do a lot of internet digging, which maybe in the pandemic, that's a good kind of deep diving you want to do. Totally fine. But we kind of need to know, it's like, well, what do these plants look like throughout the year? And so that's a really important part of the book that I'm happy with, because it teaches you to think about, okay, well, the plant's going to be blooming here, but I need to know, like, when is the foliage coming up, and then when do the seed heads come after that. And one of the tools that I teach my students, both as a design tool and a communication tool for when they're working with their clients, is doing this graphic representation on the left, right? A seasonal chart. So like Danesha mentioned, just starting to take notes of when things bloom in your yard, because what is often written about in books and catalogs, and just word to the wise, plants don't read those publications, just saying. So they sometimes do their own thing completely differently. So if you create your own seasonality chart, it helps you to make sure that you have all the seasons covered, right? So this one that I'm showing, I just pulled it out of a reference by James Hitchmo, who is a great designer over in the UK. And this one's very well articulated. He's got every month worked out, but you could just do spring, summer, fall, winter, or early, mid, late spring, early, mid, late summer, et cetera, et cetera. But by doing it graphically like this, say the pink color is when something is flowering, right, and providing pollen and nectar for our pollinator friends. And the gray bars are just when the plant still has something else to offer in terms of garden structure or garden interest. So usually, if you see the gray bars go all the way across, that's an evergreen, right? So you're always going to have some green interest in the garden, but then the hot pink bars are when it's flowering, right? So as a design tool, it's really helpful to crank this out while you're designing, because early on you can say, oh my gosh, March hardly has anything going on. I need to go back to my plant sources and figure out something for March. Everything else looks pretty good. For us, actually, if we can still find something that would be flowering into November, because sometimes we have some hot days that are continuing into then, so that would be important. And then when I'm, presenting to clients, often my clients are not plant people, right? So I can rattle off all these plant names and talk about when they bloom, but it's hard for someone to process all that information. But a graphic like this is really easy. Anyone can understand it in like under a minute, saying, okay, I totally understand. There's so much going on throughout the year, and I can see that you have all the seasons covered, right?
And can I just jump in really quick? You're just on a roll here, and it's fantastic. And I just wanted to mention to the folks watching that, Anna's the designer and the artist, and I think that's obvious when I talk about just bees, because that's all I understand. But Anne does a really nice job in the book of also laying this out. So you don't have to memorize this slide or be an expert. You just check out the book. Anne's just done a beautiful job laying it all out in the book, because that's where I actually go when I'm working on my garden, is the chart that Anne gave us in the book.
Right. We're a good team because we each taught each other a lot about, like I love bees, but all the scientific names of the bees don't stay in my brain. But man, plants, I'm all about that. So bring it on. Next slide, please. All right. And so this is a slide that actually we put together last week. And I just wanted to show you like how much has already started to pop already. And it also is a great lesson in sharing that I'm not a native plant purist. I mean, I use native plants as much as possible, but bees and other pollinators will still go to some introduced species. So I don't like that exclusionary aspect, but I do try to use as many natives as possible, just because that does impact a lot of other ecological layers. For example, like the larval host that Danesha talked about. But even now, like our red maples in the south have been going for a couple of weeks now. Flowering apricots have been going. Lenten rose that Danesha mentioned, I've seen some bees on those. Unfortunately, the carpenter bees have come out in my neighborhood. I live in a much older neighborhood, so it's just like, I'm sure the carpenter bees look at the houses like buffet. So not a favorite pollinator, although they're still important. And then the Chinese paper bush is like right outside my window, and that started blooming 2 weeks ago as well. And since we put this slide together, the red buds have come out, right? And so carefully tracking and timing all these things, we actually can provide for our pollinator friends. And there's also a case to be made that because we're relying on both native plants and some introduced plants, well-behaved introduced plants, that maybe our home gardens are more pollinator friendly because we've created this ecosystem that wouldn't necessarily happen in nature because we're using a few extra introduced species to kind of fulfill some of the time periods that are a little bit sparse.
And it's true, and also that the more diversity that we bring to our gardens, the more diversity we can support in our gardens. So more diverse garden plantings mean more biodiversity from our bees. So you're absolutely right.
Right. Next slide, please. So like Danesha said, I cannot help but not share like some of my favorite plants. And so spring is really important for our pollinator friends. As soon as it warms up, they come out, right? And they're hungry, right? So we need to provide some food. I also have purple coneflower on my list. And I also tell my students, like, it's not because these are my favorites. It's like, I don't put in plants in someone else's garden because I like them. Unless I'm planning on moving in with them, it's not appropriate, right? So I always explain to my students, you need to justify like why you're putting something in, and it can't be because you like it. But I use purple coneflower a lot in my designs because it blooms for so long. Like, it will come out in late spring for me, bloom continuously through the summer, and it will still be going until frost, right? And that's with very little deadheading. I do battle my bunnies because if I buy expensive, like new cultivars, still single whorl of blooms, right? So still okay for pollinators. I swear the bunnies go to the expensive ones. If they will not eat like freshly planted, same new tasty new growth, they won't go for the cheaper ones, only the expensive ones. I don't know how they know. The Stokecia is amazing. The Golden Alexander that Danesha mentioned. I love that one because it blooms so early, and it's also a larval food source later in the year. Baptisia is one of my favorite, not just for the flowers, right? So of course the pollinators love the flowers, but as a designer, I love the really light kind of blue-gray leaves of the foliage, which are in play the rest of the summer. And then at the end of the summer, those flower heads turn into the coolest pods that look amazing if you've got like ornamental grasses around them. I think there's a picture of that in the book, but I love the pods, I think, more than the flowers, right? But I put them in for the bees, right? Blanket flower is amazing. Personally, like, I'm not a fan of like red and yellow combinations, but that's a personal preference choice. There's no right or wrong there. It's like, you like vanilla, I like chocolate, which is a lie. I love chocolate. But with blanket flower, there's like so many different colors available. So, and I will, Danesha, you can correct me on this, but we talk in the book that the cultivated ones tend to have lower quality pollen. And so if you can, always go with the straight species of a plant. So that is true. But I'm a horticulturalist and a plant nerd, and I mean that like in the best sense of the term. So I will work in like some new cool cultivars as well. The Smalls penstemon is sort of like the underdog. It actually is such a tough plant. And I should note that all the plants that Danesha and I are talking about in the book, they're tough plants. We're not going to suggest or recommend plants that are super fussy, that you basically need to like pray over to like get to grow. No one really has that time or energy, right? So we want to do plants that are robust, that establish well, but aren't super aggressive, right? So the Smalls penstemon is another fabulous spring blooming plant. Next slide, please. And I think if you just hit the slide, advance it one more time, it should bring up all the pictures on this slide. So I love this combination that I'm showing you because Danesha already talked about the mountain mint, which is in the middle, and there's like several different kinds, and the leaves and the flowers look a little bit different, but they typically all have this gray-green foliage. And if you just saw the plant by itself, you might be thinking, well, is that really showy enough? Is it really attractive enough? And aren't bees like more attracted to like colorful plants, right? And I think typically they're attracted to high contrasting plants, right? And the contrast that we really don't see, right? They see like the nectar guides, right? But they actually love this mountain mint, and they love rattlesnake master. So we're talking about gray, green, white flowers here. And in my garden, I will have numerous pollinator species all over these plants. And I can be weeding underneath them, knocking them with my elbow, and they'll be flying off, coming back. They really don't care a hill of beans about me, right? I've never been stung, knock on wood, right? Because they don't care, right? They're not defending anything. They're just getting lunch or whatever, right? But these plants, both of them, the mountain mint and the rattlesnake master, really, really wonderful plants for pollinators. But what I love is when you put these gray, white plants in the garden, it acts as a foil for the hotter colors, right? So you have bee balm and butterfly weed and all these like really hot colors. And sometimes altogether it can be a bit much. That's also a personal preference, right? So if you love that, no worries, do your thing, right? But what's cool is you can work in some white flowering things, some silver foliage, and that just sort of gives your brain and your eyes a little bit of a rest as you're looking around this garden, right? So it's a really wonderful foil when you're working in the hot colored plants. Next slide, please. And yeah, I know I'm not talking about every plant on my slide, but it's in the book. Haha, buy the book. And then late summer and fall is really critical, right? As you all know, this is the time when our gardens are starting to give up the ghost. It's usually super hot, super dry, and plants are just struggling, right? And a lot of our garden plants, they're done, right? Their main show is done. So this is a really critical time to make sure these pollinators that are still flying, right? They've got several weeks left. They still have pollen and nectar available to them. So our native asters are tremendous, right? They kick in really late, like late summer, they'll bloom through fall. My one caveat here is they do come in different sizes and different heights, right? Heights and widths. And a lot of them get much wider than you would anticipate, right? So be sure to read the label. Although I'll say again, plants don't always know what their own labels say, right? So make sure you just give the asters a lot of room because they will sprawl. Another one that we like is goldenrod. And here's where we need to like kind of make a trade. It is bossy. And I love that term. Danesha introduced that to me. And it's such a, it's the perfect Southern way to say this plant is really aggressive. But it's perfect for this time period. So I will put mine in pots, and I'll put the pot in the ground, right? Or you could put it in a really beautiful container. So that way it doesn't run amok in the yard. And some of you might not think that that's a big deal, but if your garden is small and you put in even a native plant, if it's aggressive in nature, like the goldenrod, I would say sea oats is northern sea oats is another one. Your small garden will quickly become only those bossy plants, right, in a couple years. And then it's really hard to get them out. So putting them in pots is a really great solution. And then in my yard, the purple coneflower will still be going, right? It's amazing. So, and it's also just tough as nails. And then like Danesha said, once the flowers are done, the seed heads still remain. Some people think they look beautiful. They also provide seeds for small birds, right? So it's important. Next slide, please. And then winter interest. Again, we still want the garden to look amazing in the winter. I do rely on ornamental grasses a whole lot. Again, it's not because I like them, but I choose plants for clients, and I instruct students to choose plants for clients that are tough, that are beautiful. And this is a plant that they are generally really tough if you site them correctly, right? So they generally like full sun. They're good with dry conditions, moderate wetness. They don't like standing water as a rule. So like that Botoloa with the little floating eyebrows on the right side of the slide does not like it wet at all, right? It has to be dry. But this is a plant where you plant it, it gets established, it grows, and it looks amazing summer, fall, and fall is when a lot of the inflorescences will come out, right? So our muley grass in the top left, man, that looks amazing in the fall. It looks like it's been plugged in when the light hits it, and then it's either pink inflorescences or white. Really, really beautiful. And then again, they just go dormant, right? So you still have the form, the movement, the structure in the winter, and then in the spring, you cut them back, right? And so spring is the only season where you don't have the grass, but 3 out of 4 seasons, that's great. And any plant that I only need to touch once a year for management, that's a winner, right? And they're so beautiful. So that's why I like to use them in design. It's not because I personally like the way they look, although it's true, right? But they're really tough, right? And like Danesha said, a lot of bees like to overwinter in the stems. So it does get a little bit tricky with garden management. So when we're trying to make sure we're supporting our pollinators, that might make us adjust the management of our habitats a little bit differently. So if you can wait a little bit longer to cut your grasses back, or when you cut them back, bundle them together and leave them in the garden, right? So that way we're not disturbing the bees. And you also don't want to like remulch your gardens really heavily too early, because you're going to be obstructing the homes of a lot of those ground nesting bees, right? So if you can mulch a little bit later in the season, that's all you need to do, is like just push those gardening tasks later. If you're not a procrastinator, you need to pretend that you're a gardening procrastinator for just a little bit, right? All right, so the next slide, please. We're coming into the home stretch, right? So Danesha and I love to emphasize that no garden is too small. I mean, it's really incredible. I can plant like one new plant in my yard that's pollinator friendly, and the pollinators will come immediately, right? It's like, how do they know, right? We did this really beautiful pollinator habitat on a green roof on the NC State campus on our student center. And it was on the 5th floor, nothing there before. The day we're planting, pollinators arrived. It's like, how do they know? Are they normally flying this high? I don't think so, but they just know. Maybe they're stalkers. Maybe they were like following our trucks of plants. I don't know. But even if you only have like a container garden, right? You can make all the plants in your container pollinator friendly, right? And that is actually still helping them. If you have a small but sunny balcony, you can still create pollinator habitat. If you've got a rooftop garden, any little bit of lawn or any garden space, it's helping. Next slide, please. And I tend to design like at the residential scale. Those are the studios that I tend to teach on campus. And people will say, well, how impactful is a residential garden? And so you might think that one yard does not contribute a lot, but it actually does, right? Because we just said you plant a few plants, pollinators will come, right? And maybe your yard is just the perfect setting for them to stop and make a nice home there. But there is also research out there that they're calling spatial contagion, right? That is actually tracking if you do something like a really awesome pollinator habitat in your front yard and it looks good, guess what? It inspires your neighbors to do something similar, or to at least start to incorporate some other pollinator plants, maybe reducing their turf a little bit. And it's amazing how fast those ideas can spread. So then if we start thinking about, okay, well, maybe, you know, one residential property has X amount of impact, but when you start looking at residential properties in aggregate, the impact of incorporating some pollinator habitat can be quite profound. So with that, we wish you the very best in creating buzzworthy gardens. And we are so happy that you joined us here tonight, and we'd be more than happy to answer any questions or field any comments that you may have.
Thank you so much. It was a fun presentation to watch and definitely gave me some ideas. So I bet there are people in the audience who are taking notes. We do have a few questions already. We're going to try to keep it pretty brief because of the tornado warning, and you know, it's a little after 7. So just so you know, we'll do a few questions and we'll wrap up. Let's see. I have a question here from Goda, who says, could you kindly provide suggestions regarding places to buy the plants from, both locally as well as online, if you have any of those
So
resources.
it depends on where you are. We're both big supporters of supporting our local businesses. So, and I don't know all the ins and outs of garden centers in Durham and farther afield. It really depends on where you live, right? I've been really lucky finding lots of excellent plants at the farmers market and supporting all the vendors there. We have some really good local nurseries here in Raleigh, but we're also lucky that we're in the horticulture department. So a lot of times faculty are growing plants for classes, or students are growing plants for their classes. And they always say, hey, what do you guys need? And I'm like, rattlesnake master. Can you grow me a bunch of rattlesnake master? Because sometimes the native plants are harder to find, right? And so you do have to maybe drive a little bit farther to find those. I know one of the things that was heartbreaking for us is like niche gardens in Chapel Hill closed recently, and that was usually our go-to. But there's some other really great native plant nurseries like Curie Nursery and some other ones. So it depends on where you are. And if you need to like mail order to get some of the cool plants, do that. But we would always see if you can find it locally, right, and support those businesses.
Mm-hmm. A few specific requests for recommendations for certain circumstances. Erica says pollinator, any favorite pollinators that can handle periods of standing water, and I guess also plants as well. That would be good for that. And then Melinda asked for plants that are deer resistant. So both of those.
I love the deer. I'll let Danesha handle the first part, but like I love the deer question because it comes up a lot, and people say, why don't you write a book on deer resistant plants? Like, well, that'd probably be a pamphlet. And yeah, it really depends on like how hungry the deer are. It's like you can have a list of plants that deer absolutely do not eat, and then there'll be 10 homeowners who are like, oh no, they eat that.
Yeah, they don't read the books, right, Anne?
Right. Right.
So I can give a few examples, and Anne, you can jump in. In terms of standing water, you know, a lot of our plants that we talk about don't prefer wet feet. And if you have a lot of standing water, maybe just turn it into a swamp and put in swamp plants, right? I know flag iris, which might be considered invasive or bossy, are fine pollinator plants. Water lily, lotus, and arum are all really good water plants. But in terms of
sorry, and I was going to say that also there's also a swamp milkweed, which is gorgeous, yes, right? And that's also a great pollinator plant.
Yeah, thank you. And then a few plants that don't mind standing water for some periods of time, or some of the hardier, what we consider weedy species. The asters that Anne mentioned can take some water for some time. Joe Pye weed, and of course, I grew up with a 6 or 8 foot tall Joe Pye in the horse pasture. But I think, Anne, don't they have shorter statured Joe Pye weed? Yeah, so, you know, yeah, so again, depending on the space that you have, you might have to think about reading the labels, because some of those, the Joe Pye and the ironweed don't mind wet feet, or the asters even, but they can get quite large. And milkweeds, as Anne said. And then in terms of deer resistant, again, the deer don't always read the pamphlets, but I've found that I've had some success in gardens that are quite wooded that do tend to attract deer. Goldenrod, as Anne mentioned earlier, again, put it in a pot because it will be aggressive. The milkweeds, deer don't tend to eat those. Bee balm, catmint, and then I've heard, but I don't have experience myself, that the liatris are also deer resistant. So that's my sort of quick list off the top of my head.
And I would also add, like, depending on your setting, like if it's like fully wet like all the time, that's going to put you in one category of like a plant palette. Right. If you're designing like you're trying to collect a lot of stormwater there, so it might be short-term flooding for a little bit and then long periods of drought. There's another palette of plants that are for that. But what's really cool about landscape design is you want to try to make like every garden space that you're putting in as functional as possible. So you can certainly have a rain garden that is also pollinator habitat. So you want to try to make everything as functional as possible, and it just becomes a more important garden space.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I would add cardinal flower, because it's not only great pollinator habitat or insect pollinator, but you know, the hummingbirds and butterflies love that one, and it likes wet feet too. So
Absolutely.
And then I think the last question we're going to do is, could you recommend landscape gardeners in the area that we can use, and or how can we get in touch with you?
Well, so we're happy to like field your questions, but you know what? There's this awesome reference book that will probably answer a lot of your questions. And then as university employees, like we're really not supposed to like target other like entities, like businesses. So we can't really say the designers, but I would say as you're looking, always ask to see a portfolio. Probably the best thing is like word of mouth, right? So if you know someone who had an awesome designer, get up with them about finding their information. So it is a little bit tricky, unfortunately. There are some really excellent designers out there, and then there are some people that really aren't interested in doing excellent work or tailoring a design for a client. So it is tricky to find a good person. But I would definitely go by word of mouth and look at their portfolio. Get up with us maybe outside of this presentation, and we can have another conversation about that. But it's also one of my soapbox issues.
Yeah. All right. Well, we are going to wrap up. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight, and thank you for bearing with me with the tech. I appreciate your flexibility on that so much. And thank you to everybody who watched tonight. A couple quick things before we wrap up. If you'd like to buy a copy of Pollinator Gardening for the South, we have copies at Flyleaf. You can click the link just below our faces, or we are open for browsing Monday through Saturday from 11 to 5. And I encourage you to check out our full events calendar if you're interested in attending more Flyleaf events. We've got a lot of fun ones lined up. And if you missed part of the presentation, or you'd like to share it with a friend, maybe somebody who was holed up in their basement through this hour and wanted to be here, you can share the link and they'll be able to watch a recording. So I do encourage you to share that out if you know anyone who would be able to use this information. All right. Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.